learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to know service sector in India, learn the long-term implications of service sector, identify the factors responsible for growth in services, evaluate the reforms implication in service sector over years, and lastly, analyze changes in employment structure. Introduction. In developing countries like India, this sector can lead to inclusive growth through backward and forward links by ensuring equitable access to basic services at low prices, by creating employment opportunities and by developing human capital. India is among the world's rapidly growing economies. In 2010, the GDP grew at 10.6% as compared to an average growth rate of 7.5% in emerging and developing economies. Even though the growth rate declined to 7.2% in 2011, it continued to be above the average growth rate of emerging economies, that is, they were growing at 6.2%. The service sector has been the significant contributor to India's GDP and to its growth. Service sector is the second largest employer after agriculture sector. India's services trade has increased over time, and services account for the largest share in India's foreign direct investment, that is FDI, inflows and outflows. Service sector in India. The growth in the service sector in India has been linked to the reforms of the 1990s. In the beginning, 3 decades after independence in 1947, India was largely an agrarian economy, that is, agricultural sector dominated the Indian economy. The service sector started to grow in the mid-1980s, but growth accelerated in the 1990s when India initiated a series of economic reforms after the country faced a severe balance of payment crisis. Reforms in the service sector were a part of 1991 reform program, which led to privatization, the removal of FDI restrictions and streamlining of approval procedures, among others. Services GDP. Over time, total growth rate of India and rate of growth of its service sector have outpaced those of the world. World services growth, which was moving in tandem with its overall growth with mild peak fall movements over the years, continued to be consistently above its overall growth in the last decade, except for 2003, when the former was marginally lower than the latter. Thus, for more than a decade, this sector has been pulling up the growth of the Indian economy with a great amount of stability. The share of services in India's gross domestic product at factor cross or at current prices increased from 33.3% in 1950-51 to 56.5% in 2012-13 as per advanced estimates. There are variations in the growth and performance of different type of services. Business services, communications and trade have grown faster than the overall sector has, while others such as real estate, legal services, transport, storage, personal administration and defense have grown at the same rate, as per the study of Gordon and Gupta in 2003. Domestic demand for services such as telecommunications and financial services, along with exports of ICT, have contributed to the high growth of these services. Table 2 shows that after the 1990s, all type of services share in GDP increased, but the share of community, social and personal services declined in the sector overall. Let's look at the table. What we are going to do is, we are going to look at the share in services and share in GDP in the years 1950s, 70s, 80s, 90s and 2000s. Let's look at the share of different services. Community, social and personal services, their share in services was 36%, share in GDP 10.4% in the 1950s. In the 1970s, their share was 35.1%, share in GDP 12.6%. In 1990s, the share in services was 30.3% and in GDP 13.9%. In 2000s, their share in services was 26.1% and share in GDP was 14.0%. Financing, insurance, real estate and business services, their share was 25.2% in services, in GDP 7.5% in 1950s, in 1970s 20.3%, the share in GDP 7.3%, in 1990s 26.2% and 12.0%, and in 2000 27.3% and 14.7%. In case of trade, hotels and transport, their share in services was 28.5%, in GDP 8.5%, share in services in the 1970s was 30.2%, in GDP 10.8%, in 1990s 28.5% and share in GDP 13.0%, in 2000s 29.4% and 15.8%. In case of transport, storage and communication, in 1950s their share in services was 11.3%, share in GDP 3.4%, in 1970s share in services was 14.5%, in GDP 5.2%, in 1990s share in services 15.0%, their share in GDP was 6.9% and in 2000 share in services was 17.3% and share in GDP was 9.3%. Employment in services. Table below shows that in financial year 1993, close to 63% of the total population was engaged in agriculture, while 22% worked in services, both the formal and informal sector. Over time, the percentage of people working in agriculture has declined and employment in services has increased, although agriculture continues to have the highest share. Employment in different sectors and service industries as a percentage of total employment by fiscal years. So, what we are going to see is share of agriculture, industry and services The share of agriculture in 2009-10 was 53.2, in 2004-5 58.5, in 1990 and 2000 61.7, and in 1993-94 62.8. The share of industry was 21.5, 18.5, 15.9 and 15.2. That of services in the corresponding years was 25.3, 23.4, 22.4 and 22.0. In financial year 2009, services accounted for around 62% of total employment in the organized, that is the formal sector. However, within the service sector, over 80% of the employment was in the unorganized or informal sector. State-wise comparison of services. A comparison of services share in the gross state domestic product, which is also called GSDP, of different states and union territories in 2011-12 clearly shows that amongst all the sectors, it is the services sector which is the most dominant sector in most states of India. States and UTs such as Chandigarh, Delhi, Kerala, Mizoram, Nagaland and Karnataka have higher than all India shares. Chandigarh tops the list with a share of 85%, followed by Delhi with 81.8%. Other than Arunachal Pradesh, that is, their share 33.8%, Chhattisgarh 36.7% and Sikkim 37.0%. The services share in the GDP in all other states is more than 40%. In 2011-12, in tune with the general moderation in the overall growth of services, growth rate of services in many states also moderated. But some states continued to register high growth rates, with the highest being in Himachal Pradesh at 17.3%, followed by Bihar at 16.6%. Among UTs with high services share in GSDP, Delhi with 11.5% growth tops the list. While the services revolution in India has been becoming more broad-based, the initial momentum seems to have slowed down for some northeastern states like Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram and Nagaland after the advantage of base effect is over. FDI in the services sectors. Services sector growth is closely linked to the foreign direct investment inflows into the service sector and the role of transnational firms. While the ambiguity in classifying the different activities under the services sectors continues, the combined FDI share of financial and non-financial services, construction development and software and hotel and tourism can be taken as a rough estimate of the FDI share of services, though it could include some non-service elements. The government has been taking many policy initiatives since independence to liberalize the FDI policy for the services sector. These include liberalizing the policy on foreign investment for companies operating in the broadcasting sector, like increasing the foreign investment limit from 49% to 74% in teleports and direct to home cable networks, that is the DTH, and permitting foreign investment up to 74% in mobile TV, permitting foreign airlines to make foreign investment up to 49% in scheduled and non-scheduled air transport services, permitting FDI up to 51% in multi-brand retail trading, and amendment of the existing policy on FDI in single brand product retail trading. Causes of growth in service sector. In recent years, there has been an unprecedented growth in services across all countries. While in the advanced industrialized countries, this is seen as a continuation of the economic transformation. The above average growth of the services sector as compared with manufacturing and agriculture is also seen in some less developed countries like India. Factors behind increased share of service sector. The composition of services has also continued to change in favor of the modern and dynamic services, namely transport, communication, financial and business, including the software and related services. On the other hand, traditional trade, hotels, community and public administration services have shrunk in importance. The various explanations that have been put forward to explain the increasing share of services in GDP, investment and employment in the process of growth can be categorized as demand side factors and supply side factors. Demand side factors cause increased demand for services as growth proceeds, while supply side factors improve the supply of services. A. Demand side factors. B. Supply side factors, that is trade, liberalization and reforms. Let's look at the demand side factors. The rise in the services sector has been attributed to a number of possible factors, both from the demand as well as the supply side. It has been argued that the disproportionate growth in services, at least in case of India, is not a recent phenomena. Scholars have offered a number of explanations about the growth in services employment. An important factor for services growth is demand-led. The increased demand for services by the producers of goods and services is in part due to firms externalizing service functions that previously had been performed internally. There has been a spurt in the intermediate services demand in recent years. The growth of multinational firms, the increase in international trade and the proliferation of products are also seen as causing a rise in the demand for services. Steinbeck et al. In 1981 have argued that multinational firms that compete in increasingly complex business environments have expanded the amount of effort devoted to activities such as planning, coordination and control, and consequently have increased their use of services. Supply side factors, that is trade liberalization and reforms. Apart from the demand factors discussed above, scholars have also proposed supply side factors that have contributed to the increased role of the services sector. This is more prominently seen with regard to the services employment and with regard to advanced industrial economies. The technology-led increases in labor productivity in manufacturing sector can lead to relative changes in employment share, so that this results in the net decline in manufacturing employment and no change or increase in the services employment. The relative increase in the share of services sector employment may not be due to opportunities or productivity levels in the services sector, but it could have more to do with the productivity levels in the manufacturing sector. This is because the manufacturing sector is a learning sector while the services sector is not. A number of studies have attempted to explain the fast growth in the share of service activity observed in cross-country data. Causes for change in employment structure. The literature draws a distinction between demand and supply side, as studies made by Kravis, Francois and Reinhardt in 1996. On the supply side, the share of service can be boosted by a switch to a more service input intensive method of organizing production. Such a change in production methods can arise as a result of increasing specialization as the economy matures. For example, over time, industrial firms may make greater use of specialist subcontractors to provide services that were previously provided by the firms themselves. Legal, accounting and security services are obvious candidates to be contracted out. Bhagwati in 1994 calls this process of specialization splintering. Kravis in 1982 points out that splintering will lead to growth in the share of services in GDP, even when GDP itself is not growing. On the demand side, a rise in output share of the services can arise from rapid growth in the final demand for services. This could be from domestic consumers with a high income elasticity of demand for services or from foreign consumers with a growing demand for the country's service exports. Demand-led growth of this type is likely to result, at least initially, in higher prices of services as well as a shift of resources into the production of services. Service activity can also be stimulated by technological advances whereby new activities or products emerge as a result of technological breakthrough. Such advances are likely to be particularly relevant in the case of IT sector, for example, the internet, telecommunication, for example, cellular phone services, and to some extent in financial services like credit cards, ATMs, etc. Liberalization can also provide a boost to services. In India, crucial policy reforms were made in the 1990s, which acted as a turning point in India's economic growth and were conducive to the growth of service sector such as deregulation, privatization and opening up to FDI. If the growth of services was previously inhibited by government controls, then policy changes may provide a positive shock that unleashes new activity and growth. Growth in the share of service sector in GDP is often followed by a corresponding growth in the service sector share in total employment in the economy. However, in India, we find that though there has been a phenomenal growth in the service sector, this growth has not been followed by a corresponding high growth in employment in the 1990s. This rise in the share of services in employment has been much slower than the decline in the share of agriculture and manufacturing in total employment. This shows that while output generation has shifted to services, employment generation in services has lagged far behind. In the year 1999, services contributed around 28.5% of total employment, in contrast to 30% in middle income countries, 70% in Singapore and around 39% in Indonesia. While the share of service sector in total employment was around 28.5% in the period 1999 to 2000, the share of employment differed for different services. In 1999-2000, the share of different services in the total employment in the private sector was as follows. Share of trade, hotels and restaurants was 34%, followed by the community, social and personal services around 31%, and then by construction 16% and transport, storage and communication services 13% only. Though this is a unique feature of the service-led growth of India, we find that there exist none of the empirical studies that explain this. Some of the plausible explanations for the slow growth of employment in the service sector can be: A. Sectors that have large potential for generating employment are growing slowly. B. The fast growing services sectors also witness high labor productivity growth. As a result, the employment potential is lower in these sectors. C. Trade is positively affecting the growth in those services that do not have large potential for generating employment. Long-term growth implications. One of the critical issues that have been discussed in the literature is the role played by services in the growth process. Though a forceful case is put forward that services can become the major driving force of economic growth, in case of India, the sustainability of a service-led growth has been questioned by many. For example, by Mitra, Bhattacharya Mitra and Arunachalam and Kumar in 2002. It has been argued that income from service sector is growing much in excess of the demand generated for services by the commodity sector, and since income might grow faster than employment in the organized services, therefore service-led growth can have serious implications for inflation, income distribution and balance of payments. In short, it is argued that this growth is not sustainable in the long run. The argument becomes more relevant since economic theory suggests that a fall in the share of agriculture sector and manufacturing sector is a phenomena which is generally associated with the growth process of a high income economy and not a developing country. To test the issue of sustainability of service-led growth in India, Gordon and Gupta in 2004 attempt to find out whether India is an outlier in this case by using cross-country data on sectoral shares in GDP and fitting a trend line. They find that the share of service sector in GDP is associated positively with per capita income. That is, the countries with higher per capita income also have a larger share of services in GDP. In case of India, they find that in 1990, share of India's service sector in GDP was very close to the average share predicted by linear relationship. However, as a result of rapid growth of services in 1990s, by 2001, India's share of services moved above the average share by as much as 5 percentage points. But in spite of this, they do not find India to be an outlier at present. However, they argue that if different sectors in India grow at the average growth rates experienced in 1996 to 2000, then by 2010, the share of services would increase to 58%. This would bring size of India's service sector relative to GDP closer to that of an upper middle income country, even though India would still belong to the low income group. Hansda in 2001 addresses issue of sustainability of the service-led growth of India in terms of intersectoral linkages as emanating from input-output tables for 1993-94 for 115 activities at disaggregated level. The results indicate that while services and agriculture do not share much interdependence, industry is found to be the most service intensive, with 70% of its activities being direct services intensive. The intersectoral linkages are explored further by estimating Rasmussen indices of backward and forward linkages. The indices show that service sector is more growth inducing as compared to other sectors in terms of backward and forward linkages. He therefore argues that growth in service sector will induce growth in other sectors. The issue of sustainability of services growth, that is, whether the lack of rise in the share of manufacturing sector and the corresponding shift to services is sustainable or not, is further examined by Banga and Golder in 2004. In this regard, the study estimates the impact of higher use of services input on productivity growth of manufacturing sector. They construct a multilateral total factor productivity index for 41 major industry groups for the period 1980-81 to 1999-2000. The growth of the service sector has important implications for the economic analysis. In some respects, the current situation is analogous to the shift from agriculture to industry. In retrospect, it is apparent that this shift had considerable influence on economic analysis. Land became less important as an input in production and distribution models, and physical capital became much more important. The requirement for theory of imperfect competition became more apparent. Short-run supply curves cannot now be considered as completely inelastic, and the possibilities of increasing returns had to be examined with greater rigor. Implications of the growth of service industry employment concerns the labor embodiment of technological change. This refers to a situation where technological change or an advance in knowledge affects productivity through new additions to the labor force. In many service industries, it is not enough to know by how much demand has changed in order to predict the effect on productivity. The two other dimensions of demand along with quantity must be specified clearly. One source of variation arises because output is frequently uneven, more or less, with peaks in output occurring at a particular hour of the day, particular days of the week, and even particular weeks of the month. Such fluctuations are important for retailing, banking, barber and beauty shops, places of amusement, and some local government services. During non-peak times, there usually exists idle capacity. An increase in demand, if occurs at these times of non-peak demand, it may result in the very substantial gains in productivity. On the other hand, an increase in demand occurring at times of peak demand will probably not result in any increase in the productivity. A second source of variation is the size of transaction. Measures of real output in the service sector are always unsatisfactory. As this sector becomes more important, the aggregate measure must become less satisfactory in the absence of significant improvements in the measures for individual industries. Summary. To summarize, in this module, we studied about service sector in India. It was only 1980s onwards that service sector started leading economic growth. Before that period, industrial sector or agriculture sector had larger share. There are various demand side and supply side factors which lead to increased share of services in GDP. For example, the increased demand for services by the producers of goods and services is in part due to firms externalizing service functions that previously had been performed internally. Growth of multinational firms, the increase in international trade, and the proliferation of products are also seen as causing an increase in liberalization. We also studied about the long-term implications of growth in service sector. The results indicate that while services and agriculture do not share much interdependence, industry is found to be most service intensive, with 70% of its activities being direct services intensive. Service sector is more growth inducing as compared to other sectors in terms of backward and forward linkages. Growth in service sector will induce growth in other sectors.